I can. Okay. So I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Saul Ettlin, who's a real estate consultant with the Northern California Community Loan Fund. But Saul and I go way back and have worked together at NCN and at Tides before then. So brings with him a lot of shared space expertise and has some really interesting ideas to share. So with that, take it away. Oh, and the other thing is, Saul is also on our steering committee. So.
I am.
So, he keeps me in line.
I think it's the other way around. I come in say, let's do all this stuff. And then she's like, well, maybe, which is the right answer. So we're going to turn from all the great data and how do we activate our space and work with our tenants. This is a little bit more, we're going to be down here in sort of the transaction and how do we get access to real estate, and one solution to sort of the challenges that nonprofits face when they're operating in the commercial real estate market. So my name's Saul Ettlin. I'm with the Northern California Community Loan Fund. The Loan Fund is a nonprofit lender in San Francisco. It's a community development financial institution. For those of you who don't know about it, what those are, I can talk about it later with you. We lend to other nonprofits. We primarily do affordable housing lending. We also do a lot of community facilities lending, and we'll do operating capital for nonprofits as well. Because of the goofy San Francisco real estate market over the years, NCCLF has been able to develop a nonprofit real estate consulting practice. So I'm part of a team of 12 people that help nonprofits on the full spectrum of real estate, everything from just looking at leases, kind of broker-like activities, although we're not brokers, but giving them advice, looking at what will happen, sort of the financial impacts of their lease, to lease versus buy analysis, and even some building operations and sort of streamlining building operations. We also do new market tax credit consulting, and you can ask me more about that if you've never heard of that before. So the stuff I'm going to go over, the idea of a real estate holding entity probably makes the most sense in really active markets like San Francisco, but really could be applied in other places and regionally. I'll get into some of the way the solutions that the holding entity can provide. So some of the challenges. There's just a straight up acquisition challenge from nonprofits. There's a disconnect between the way the commercial market works and the way nonprofits are able to assemble capital. The commercial market, we just call it fast money. It's ready to move. If the deal can work, the money is often there for folks who want to, organizations that are well capitalized can do a transaction. Nonprofits take time to raise money. They need some way to, get into the deal that allows them to do a capital campaign, to raise the sort of unrestricted operating money that they need to be able to eventually take title of the building. This one, and I think this one I've seen mostly from NCN over the years at conferences, is we've always got the sort of lessons learned. There are so many of the accidental developers, right? It's the executive director who's like, I want that building. It's beautiful and it'll do exactly what we're doing. That's not the wrong answer. The thing to remember here is the accidental developer means that they're going to build the plane while flying it, so it's going to make the real estate transaction more expensive, right? It's going to be like, oh, I didn't know about entitlements. So it's two steps forward, one step back. The other issue here is when the ED or whoever in the organization is doing the development process, where does the rest of their work go? Our nonprofits are already thin with capacity, human capital, and so when somebody in the organization becomes the developer, that can leave a hole in the organization. So moving away from ownership and development, leasing has its challenges too. This is particularly true for San Francisco, where folks who got into a lease in 2011 and were in a 5-year lease, their rent was $2 or $24 a square foot or annually, and they came out and they were looking at $3.50 or $4, and getting displaced from the communities they serve. I think the other thing too, organizations for sure can get into longer leases, but when we have short leases, it can be a barrier for them to be able to invest in the kind of tenant improvements in a space that will really make the space work for them to meet their mission, right? So that they have the kinds of whether it's a human service organization, less so with arts organizations because they really need longer term leases, but the other kinds of needs that you would have for your space that's aligned with your mission. There's a real estate ownership challenge. So owning real estate is a program. It's going to be a brand new program. It's going to have somebody that's in charge of it. They're going to have to dedicate time to it. It's going to have its own budget. And sometimes that program is not aligned. It pulls at your mission. And so understanding that this is a challenge for organizations that own buildings that decide to outsource real estate management and operations to property management, my experience at Tides, we found it hard. We eventually were able to. We found it difficult to find commercial property management that understood our mission-driven real estate model. It was tough to have that conversation, and we also had to take time with a property manager for them to learn how we want to operate real estate. And so there is a gap out there around mission-driven real estate property management and asset management. So a solution there are some examples around the country, which I'll show later, is the notion of a nonprofit real estate holding entity. So real estate holding entities in the commercial market are part of the, if you've heard of REITs, they're a legal framework to put the building or a set of buildings. In this idea is that it's an organization in a community, it's either a city like San Francisco or a region, that its job is to help with real estate for the organizations in its community. It can do, really we kind of see it doing three key things, or we've seen them do three key things, although the last one's a little bit less. Creating a pathway to ownership. The holding entity is capitalized in a way that it can actually do the transaction and hold the building to give time to meet that gap between fast money and slow money for the nonprofit to be able to take title. And raise the capital so that it can own the building and probably learn how to become a real estate operator. What's great is they get to be in the building that they're eventually going to buy. So they don't have to wait to raise the money and then move in after they've been able to transact. Real estate holding entities, this is deeply aligned with the Nonprofit Centers Network, can hold and lease space. Kind of like a land trust for commercial real estate, but the idea being, in particular, multi-tenant centers, so that you can create affordable permanent space in communities. And the last one, which we haven't seen quite as much of, but probably if you're to help build a financial model that works for the holding entity to be sustainable, is property and asset management. And that means doing it in a mission-aligned way, so that the people that are helping make sure that the building has what it needs to operate understand the mission of the user or their client in the case when they sign an agreement. Excuse me, sorry. So real estate holding entities, why do them is you would have ongoing professional staff that understand the real estate market. It's probably two different teams. It's there are people in the real estate world that know development and acquisition and development, and there are other people who are really strong in asset management and property management. The organization could have both, depending on community needs. You might not do all of them in your holding entity. The ability to transact quickly. So as we'll see from our examples, capitalization is kind of key, like who's going to support the thing as it gets started. But once there's a professional team with some resources to go buy a building, they can move in that fast market. I think that holding entities can assemble interesting sets of capital too. So, traditional real estate might just use, commercial lending to be able to do the building with probably some equity from an equity investor. Nonprofit holding entity could probably, build trust with the foundation community and use program-related investments or PRIs. And the private sector does this as well, but also become well-versed in using new markets and historic tax credits, which bring equity, and we can talk about that afterwards if people have questions. And then probably also do other cool stuff like, community-driven fundraising campaigns, whether it's crowdsourcing or other kinds of community bonds. I think the Center for Social Innovation uses community bonds. Other interesting models that also gets the community involved in the acquisition. On the asset management side, really being able to, so the organizations aren't just running their one building, that they can achieve some economies of scale, right? That the holding entity can enter into the janitorial contracts or to the elevator maintenance contracts or a series of things where they're able to sort of navigate that world and hopefully save a little bit of money. I think another really interesting piece here, and I think NCN plays a role in doing this work, is being able to assemble a set of users, and this is a piece of it, is really understanding and learning and understanding the space needs of the nonprofit sector in their community, right? And so is it creating shared space and finding the organizations that are aligned, doing some of the collaborative work, building some of the trust, being the neutral third-party building operator who doesn't have a dog in the race? I think there's a really key role. Ultimately, all of this is about creating permanent affordable space, right? It's that this development entity is a nonprofit, and its interest is in creating affordable space for other nonprofits. So with all of that, turn to some examples. A great one right here in Urban Land Conservancy here in Denver. It was capitalized with $10 million and $5 million in land. Today they own, or they have control of $86 million of real estate. They run the full gamut. They do housing, commercial real estate, retail. They have land that they've held for future development. The Northern California Community Loan Fund, we incubated. It's up and off on its own, is an organization called Community Art Stabilization Trust, or CAST. They started working in San Francisco. I think they're starting to work into the East Bay. They mostly, at this point, focus on the pathway to ownership. These two projects here, the luggage tour and counterpulse, they used new market tax credits, and they were funded by the Kenneth Rainin Foundation to be able to buy these buildings. The tenants are, the owners are in them, and they have 7 years over the new markets compliance period to assemble, the funds to be able to buy CAST out of the deal. CAST will probably keep growing in the way and start looking at those other structures, the other kinds of service offerings as it moves forward. Spaceworks in New York. They focus on rehearsal and studio space for artists around Manhattan, not in Manhattan, but around Manhattan, mostly probably because of the cost of real estate. New York City made capital investment of $5.3 million into them to get them going. I think they have 5 buildings. This one's a little different. This is another San Francisco example. This is PlaceMade. Its sister organization is called SFMade. They focus on promoting manufacturing in San Francisco. This is their first big project. This is 150 Hooper, and they are in a larger development project where the big developer gave them the land, and so they were able to leverage the land in the new market structure, so they were able to create some equity there. This will be 50,000 square feet of light manufacturing to preserve light manufacturing in San Francisco. I like, the PlaceMade itself is nonprofit. Of course, they'll have a mix of users in their building. But this is an interesting deal where it wasn't necessarily capitalized with sort of government or foundation investment. Why this matters? So my former employer, Tides operates 150,000 square feet of office space in the Presidio. They are committed to affordable rent. This might be a little hard for folks to see, but the blue line is the Tides rents, and the orange lines are Class B market over the last 20 years. And you can see how Tides tenants were able to stave off the ups and downs of the commercial real estate market in San Francisco. If you're ever in San Francisco, it's a great building to go visit. So for organizations that are wanting to start these or add this into their mix, this is, as you can see from the examples, they got investment from foundations or government. So there's a conversation in your community about, is this the right kind of tool for your community? And is there some partnership where they'll come in and help support the initial investments to be able to get it off the ground? Who can do these? Certainly land trusts, they basically do it already, but should they focus on doing more commercial? Community developers also do a little bit of commercial development and could do more of it and do more of this work. And I think certainly nonprofit centers, sort of the big ones who really understand real estate and really feel comfortable working in that space could continue to expand their work and buy and activate other buildings and consider these other ways about creating ownership for other organizations in their communities. It's worth noting, however, all the examples were all new things, right? They didn't start from as an offshoot of an existing organization. They may have been incubated by another organization. So starting something new may be because of the dynamics in a community and who's running the thing. It might be a wise way to start with something new. So, I don't know if I went too fast. This can be a really great tool, holding entity in communities, to sort of smooth out the differences between the private, commercial real estate market and what nonprofits need, as well as help nonprofits that have buildings to operate their buildings more successfully. And I think with that, I am ready for questions.
Excellent. You're right on time. You're doing really good. So
I had a long conversation about whether or not I'd stay within 20 minutes.
It's true. Are there questions for Saul in the room about this concept of real estate holding entities?
We've talked, and we'll have to continue to talk because I have like about 30 questions probably for you. But and by the way, we were just commenting. It sounds like you wrote this presentation specifically for us because we basically are that inadvertent developer. Right?
Accidental developer.
Accidental
yes.
developer, right?
Just like all of our organizations have accidental IT directors or accidental fundraisers or you name it. Like that's the world we live in. But yes, go ahead.
So one thing that has come up, we're a social justice organization, and in the Bay Area, like property's hugely impacted. Even for a well-meaning nonprofit that has funding, you're not going to get something on Market Street or in downtown San Francisco without paying a real pretty penny for that. And so what has happened, what I've seen is that nonprofits are moving into kind of marginal neighborhoods. And the question that comes up a lot is gentrification. And when sometimes you have direct service organizations that are directly impacting that community, but in many cases they're getting pushed out of those communities in favor of other kind of advocacy nonprofits. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how these holding companies, or if any of these are dealing with that issue, or what that conversation's like in this space right now.
I mean, No, I don't have an answer to that question. Generally, I do think it's like, and I think at NCCLF we've been starting to have this conversation too about sort of how can we support ownership and development, but also be realistic, because of exactly the issue. And this is a very Bay Area issue, although I would imagine other active markets have the same question going on. So that we put in a nice new multi-tenant center in a community that brings a bunch of new people to the neighborhood, and like what's that impact on the surrounding neighborhood? The best way would be is if your users were like the organizations that are already there, and you're getting them permanent space so that as other influxes happen in the community, they don't get pushed out. But I think it's important to have long conversations about the communities you're going to build in. That's like that's general development. But I do think a holding entity like this could, depending on who runs it, could be really sensitive and be thoughtful, and it could even be part of its mission about how it engages in that kind of development.
Other questions? Other thoughts about how we can create affordable space for nonprofits in our communities?
How would you assess if your group is a good candidate to do this? Like if you have the capacity to do this?
Yeah, I think, the first thing is just, I think you're gonna have to look at your own finances and think about how real estate fits your mission. And like, if you already have, or do you already have a building? You don't own it yet. You have to think about the community need. And I think it's a conversation with funders and with the board. Like this is a program, right? Like it's a big lift, and it's a thing that you really want to commit yourself to. And I can't stress enough like the part about, you're going to have to assemble a team too. Like you want to probably find seasoned real estate people who've done this stuff, who are ready to would like to go work for a social mission-driven organization. There's not a lot of opportunities out there for folks who are super smart about real estate to come and work in a thing like this. So I'd imagine there's some probably talent out there you could be attracting. But It's like a full business plan. Like this is like, starting a new thing, even if you're going to incubate it. So it's a lot of, there's a lot of moving parts to thinking about it. But I think it's more, from the organization's perspective, just like you take on any new program, it's just conversation with staff and board and really kind of sitting down and then testing the waters with funders to see if they're going to come in and support you in doing that. Hi.
So I'm from Denver Shared Spaces. This is kind of my world here
Yay.
locally. So work very much with ULC and are very familiar with their model, which is not ownership to the organization. It's a 99-year land
That's right.
lease. Is that common? I guess I have a multifold question. Is that, I'm trying to understand the place-made model specifically,
They're owning. They will own and hold and own in perpetuity. Like,
including the land.
yes.
Okay.
They were
so
donated
it's a
the
little
land, is
different.
my
So
understanding.
in Denver, what's happened most often is that there's an organization who has more building than they need.
Yep.
And so they go to ULC and ask them to buy it.
Yep.
So that way they can get out of the whole asset management
So they're just,
world and just focus on having a low long-term lease.
nope, that's a
So
great
is
model.
that-
I mean, I do think like we have to be creative about this stuff. Like there's a lot of different structure rights. Tides is on a 55-year master lease with the Presidio, right? They don't own that building, but it let them get in easily. And then they did a $15 million bond to redevelop. I just think you're
Yeah, it's
exactly
just-
right.
it's
Like
just
also
so-
different.
It's so different in my head than a REIT. So I'm
What's
like,
that?
it's such a different model than a REIT in my mind. So I'm just trying to see the connection between a holding company and a land banking organization. So maybe we can talk a little bit later.
Yeah, I don't think I think between a land trust and what a holding entity do, I don't think it's that big of a difference. It's just that the holding entity may just either is creating a pathway to ownership so that they can get knocked out and let the nonprofit buy, or may just hold and operate affordable space. And the land trust does a shared ownership structure or some other kind of structure where they're like, we're going to preserve the space. And that great example that you had of like the nonprofits, like we're done being an owner. We're tired of fixing the HVAC. We're tired of all that stuff.
That happens more often than the inverse of a nonprofit saying that I want to take on a 99-year land lease. It's more often happening, you take it on and I will just be a renter.
We don't see that happening. Well, maybe I'm not aware of it. I haven't seen that happening where we're at, but it's great to hear that that's a model that's working here. And I think that we should add that to the deck because I think it's awesome.
Hey, Saul, we have a few questions online here. Does NCCLF offer programming to advance the pathway to property ownership?
Well, we work with our clients to assess whether or not their organization is ready to look at ownership, and what are the steps that they would have to take to consider pathway. So yes, I guess is the answer to the question.
Hi, I'm here in Denver and actually know a real estate company that I know Katie knows of too, Conscious Real Estate, and they actually are committed to having 10% of their commission, I believe, go to a nonprofit of the new homeowner's choice. And I was just curious if you've heard of other real estate companies that are doing that. If you are in the Denver area, they're called Conscious Real Estate, so maybe get on their list.
And I- Yeah, no, I mean, that's a new model, that's new to me, but that's great to hear.
All right, another question online. Can you provide a quick overview of the steps to set up a nonprofit real estate holding entity?
No. But I'd be happy to, if somebody
you for
wants
your
to,
honesty.
once somebody wants to email me, we're happy to have a longer conversation.
Great.
But
So we'll
there's
go
not a
on.
lot of, there's not a,
It can't be done
it's a
quickly.
thing.
Yes.
And it's very, like, this is still, like, I do think, like, this is, like, when we talk nationally about how real estate acts, like, I also think you've really got to understand what's happening in your community, right? So, like, you have a thing where it sounds like nonprofits are like, we're ready to, like, do this thing with our building, and you got brokers and transactors who are like, oh, we want to give some money. So, like what's happening in your community will really impact what that holding entity looks like and who the other players in the community already are.
Great. So we'll move on to the next one. What is the difference between nonprofit real estate and co-op housing?
Well, probably, so what I'm talking about specifically is commercial real estate, not residential. So there is a lot of actors that are working to create affordability and ownership opportunities for individuals and families around housing. That's different than this. I mean, of course there are similarities. The land trusting model can work in a lot of different ways, but So I just think there's some dynamics there. Most co-op housing probably is owned by a nonprofit. That's that all of the homeowner or the dwellers are part members in. It depends. They also may create some kind of other equity model, but there's a lot of ways to do governance. I mean, Katie, the NCN also does training on governance around legal structures for holding and owning real estate. But I would imagine, co-housing or co-op could be, totally like a holding entity. It could be like lots of other things.
Thanks. This is a bit tangential, but I'm just wondering if you have any advice for those of us who do lease. We're starting to think about what does it mean to expand our space, and yeah, my impression is that we are very vulnerable in a very kind of fluctuating market. So yeah, beyond like finding a good broker who's worked with nonprofits before and that kind of stuff. Like any tips in that process?
Yeah, I think I would start to understand who the nonprofit building owners are in your community, because I think you have an asset. OpenGov Hub has an asset to bring to a building, especially if they have sort of persistent vacancy. And I would start looking at, think about the others who hold real estate. There are lots of big national institutions that their business models have changed, and so they have empty space. So I think it starts to think about it creatively, and then of course you have a runway that's long enough. I think, what did you say? You have 7 years left on your? 7 months. Yeah, you could think about ownership. Like I think when you do co-working or shared workspace, like it's harder to make the model work with leasing and releasing, right? Because of that gap. So like since you're already a real estate actor, like I would start thinking about just buying. Not that it's simple. I know that like it's easy for me to stand up here and be like, you should just buy a building. But I do think given your mission and what you're trying to do, that doesn't mean you couldn't come up with really great partnerships with other nonprofits who own real estate. And maybe you come in as the operator of the building. To your example, somebody's got a big building or part of a building, and they're like, I'm done running real estate. Then OpenGov Hub, who's like, we're still kind of think that it's fun, and we'll do that for you, and then we'll work out a deal. I think what's really interesting, I think Katie's seen many examples as well, is like getting really creative about how we solve real estate questions for nonprofits is always the question. But to really scale, having some kind of entity that brings ongoing, that's just a team that thinks about it every day, right? And that's really a big piece of the holding entity. It lets foundations be like, I know if I give them $5 million, they're going to do the thing that they said to do because they're the team that does this, right? Or government who wants to contract, and then the holding entity team also gets to know the developers and gets to know what's happening in the community. So.
I swear I'm not going to completely hijack the comment period, but just back to this question about what to do if you're leasing space, and if you have several years left to go on your lease, tweak your business model so you can try to put $0.25 a square foot or $1 a square foot away in a capital reserve fund. So when it comes time to buy that building, you have a nest egg that you've earned and not a nest egg that you have to raise. So see what you can do to finagle. Go from there. Other
comment.
questions?
Red card.
Oh.
Off the field. Go.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just thinking how
She's in charge.
how shared space is a little, what I've been learning about how shared space models are working. What came to mind as you were speaking, Saul, was the idea of a condo association.
Yep.
And I didn't know if that is something that had been discussed or.
We have an example happening in San Francisco, and I'd be happy, for folks who want to talk about it, I'd be happy to explain it more later.
Excellent.
Since I got the red card.
Saul has the red card. There's still time. There's happy hour. There's lots of time to talk to people, and everybody's contact information's in the participant directory. So if you need to shoot emails to folks, that information is there. So our next speaker, round of applause for Saul.